There is a specific, terrifying symphony to a catastrophic car accident. It doesn't happen in a blur of silence like they show in the movies. It happens in a deafening, visceral explosion of sensory nightmares, the agonizing screech of tearing metal, the explosive, concussive force of airbags deploying, the shattering of safety glass turning into a million diamond-like projectiles, and finally, the crushing, unbearable weight of a commercial semi-truck completely obliterating the driver's side of your vehicle. I was 34 years old when my life as I knew it effectively ended on a rain-slicked interstate just outside the city. I didn't lose consciousness immediately. I remember the suffocating smell of gasoline and burnt rubber. I remember the terrifying realization that I could not feel my legs. I remember the metallic taste of blood in my mouth and the muffled, frantic voices of the paramedics using the jaws of life to peel the crushed roof of my sedan away like the lid of a tin can. Then, there was nothing but darkness. When I finally woke up, my reality was confined to the sterile, blinking, incessantly beeping environment of the intensive care unit. The pain was an ocean, and I was drowning in it. I had suffered a fractured pelvis, 2 shattered femurs, 6 broken ribs, a collapsed lung, and severe internal bleeding. I was encased in a terrifying halo brace, my body pinned to a highly specialized orthopedic bed, entirely dependent on machines to keep my lungs inflating and my heart beating. I was entirely, utterly helpless, a prisoner in a shattered cage of bone and flesh. My parents had passed away when I was in my early 20s. I was a freelance architectural consultant, unmarried, and fiercely independent. The only living family I had left consisted of my late mother's sister, Aunt Margaret, her husband, Uncle Richard, and their 25-year-old daughter, my cousin Vanessa. Growing up, they had been the quintessential estranged relatives. Margaret was a woman entirely consumed by the pursuit of status she could not afford. Richard was a serial entrepreneur whose businesses routinely imploded, leaving behind trails of debt and burned bridges. Vanessa was a spoiled, relentlessly entitled mirror image of her mother. They had never approved of my parents' modest working-class lifestyle, and after my parents died, I hadn't seen or spoken to them in nearly a decade. They had never once remembered my birthday. They had never checked in. So, you can imagine my profound, heavily medicated confusion when my eyes fluttered open in the ICU, and the very first face I saw hovering over my bed was Aunt Margaret's. "Oh, thank God," Margaret gasped. She pressed a perfectly manicured hand to her chest, her face crumpling into an expression of absolute, devastating sorrow. She was wearing a subdued gray cashmere sweater, smelling aggressively of expensive jasmine perfume. Before I could even attempt to speak through the dry, raw, agonizing pain in my throat, she leaned down and kissed my forehead. "We are here, Evelyn," Margaret wept, her voice trembling with manufactured emotion. "We are right here. You are safe. Family is here." I couldn't move my head because of the brace, but my eyes darted to the side. Uncle Richard was standing next to her, looking solemn and deeply concerned, holding a bouquet of expensive white lilies. "We rushed here the second the hospital called," Richard said, his voice dropping into a comforting paternal baritone that I had never ever heard him use before. "We thought we had lost you, Evie. We've been sitting in the waiting room for 3 days. 3 days. I had been unconscious for 3 days. Water," I croaked, the single word feeling like swallowing broken glass. Margaret immediately sprang into action. She grabbed a small sponge on a stick, dipped it in a cup of ice water, and gently pressed it to my cracked lips. It was an act of such tender, profound care that, in my vulnerable, shattered state, it brought hot tears to my eyes. "Shh! Don't try to speak," Margaret hushed me, stroking my hair. "You just focus on healing. We are going to take care of everything. We aren't going to let you go through this alone." For the next 4 weeks, my aunt and uncle orchestrated a master class in devoted family care. I was transferred from the ICU to a long-term trauma rehabilitation wing. The pain management required heavy doses of intravenous narcotics that left my brain perpetually swimming in a thick, cloudy fog. I was drifting in and out of lucidity, terrified of my future, terrified that I would never walk again. And through it all, Margaret and Richard were my unwavering sentinels. Margaret brushed my hair. She spoon-fed me broth when I was too weak to lift my arms. Richard handled the hospital administrators, bullying nurses into giving me extra blankets and better rooms. They played the role of the fiercely protective, loving family so perfectly that the hospital staff constantly praised them. "You are so lucky to have them, Evelyn," a night nurse told me one evening while checking my vitals. "Most patients with your level of trauma get abandoned after the first week. Your aunt hasn't left this floor in a month." I felt a deep, profound wave of guilt for ever thinking poorly of them in the past. I assumed that the specter of death had fundamentally changed them. I assumed that tragedy had bridged the decade-long gap between us, washing away their superficial vanity and revealing a bedrock of familial love. I was an absolute, naive fool. The true nature of their devotion revealed itself during my 5th week in the hospital. I was finally coherent enough to meet with the hospital's legal and financial liaison, alongside a representative from the commercial trucking company, whose driver had fallen asleep at the wheel and crushed my car. Margaret and Richard were sitting on either side of my bed. Margaret was holding my hand. The trucking company's corporate lawyer was sweating profusely. It was an open and shut case of gross, catastrophic negligence. The driver had been over his legal driving hours by a staggering margin. The truck's brakes had failed a recent inspection, and the corporate logs had been doctored. The company was terrified of a public jury trial that could expose their systemic safety violations. "Miss Hayes," the corporate lawyer said, his voice trembling slightly, "my clients are prepared to offer a comprehensive, pre-litigation settlement to cover all past, present, and future medical expenses, as well as significant compensatory damages for your pain, suffering, and loss of future earnings." I stared at the ceiling, feeling nothing but a profound emptiness. "How much?" I rasped. The lawyer cleared his throat. $12 million, tax-free. Wired to your accounts within 14 days of signing the non-disclosure and liability release forms. The silence in the hospital room was absolute. $12 million! It was a sum of money so unimaginably massive that my brain literally could not process it. But Margaret's brain processed it perfectly. I felt her hand, the hand that had been so gently holding mine, suddenly twitch. Her grip tightened instinctively, a microscopic spasm of pure, unadulterated greed. "That is a significant sum," Uncle Richard said. His voice was remarkably steady, but I could hear the faint, suppressed vibration of absolute euphoria beneath it. "However, my niece is in no condition to negotiate or manage such a complex financial portfolio right now. She is heavily medicated. She is traumatized." "I agree," Margaret chimed in instantly, her tone shifting seamlessly back into the fiercely protective mother bear. "Evelyn cannot be burdened with banking, logistics, and legal jargon while she is fighting to regain the ability to walk. We need to establish a protective barrier for her." I can hire a financial advisor," I mumbled, feeling a sudden strange prickle of unease cutting through the narcotic fog. "Oh, sweetheart, no," Margaret cooed, leaning over and stroking my cheek. "Financial advisors are sharks. They'll drain you dry with management fees the second they see a settlement that large. You need family. You need people who actually love you to protect this money." Richard pulled his chair closer. "Evelyn, the hospital social worker already discussed this with us. Given your immobility and the heavy narcotics you are prescribed, you are legally considered temporarily incapacitated. We need to establish a medical and financial conservatorship. Just a temporary one, just until you are out of rehab and back on your feet." "Conservatorship?" I echoed, the word sounding ugly and dangerous. "Like, giving you control of my money?" "It's a legal formality, Evie," Richard assured me, his smile wide and comforting. "It just allows us to sign the settlement papers on your behalf, pay your hospital bills directly, and set up the trusts so the money is waiting for you when you heal. We are your family. Family protects each other." They spent the next 3 days relentless wearing me down. Every time I expressed doubt, Margaret would start crying, accusing me of not trusting the woman who had wiped my chin and bathed me for a month. They isolated me. When my friends from my architectural firm tried to visit, Margaret intercepted them in the lobby, claiming I was too exhausted and emotionally fragile to see anyone but immediate family. They took my cell phone, claiming the screen time was giving me migraines and inhibiting my neurological recovery. I was trapped in a bed, in excruciating pain, cut off from the outside world, and utterly dependent on them for my survival. The psychological pressure was immense. They weren't just asking for control, they were demanding it as repayment for their loving sacrifice. On a rainy Thursday afternoon, Richard brought his own private lawyer into my hospital room. The man slapped a thick stack of legal documents onto my tray table. "It's just a temporary proxy, Evelyn," Margaret whispered, kissing my cheek. "Just sign it, and you never have to worry about a medical bill or a legal threat again. We will carry the burden for you." I was so tired. The painkillers made the room spin. I just wanted to sleep. I wanted the pressure to stop. I took the pen with a trembling, weakened hand. I signed my name on the dotted line. I signed over complete legal, medical, and financial control of my life, and my $12 million settlement to Margaret and Richard. When the ink dried, I saw Margaret look at Richard over my bed. It was a fleeting glance, lasting no more than a second. But in that second, the mask of the loving, devoted aunt vanished entirely. Her eyes were cold, triumphant, and predatory. It was the look of a spider watching the fly finally stop struggling in the web. The shift in their behavior was not immediate, but it was undeniable. Once the conservatorship was filed with the court, and the $12 million settlement was officially wired into a trust account controlled by Richard, the devoted family act began to rapidly evaporate. Margaret no longer sat by my bed for hours. She started showing up for only 20 minutes a day, usually wearing brand new, incredibly expensive designer clothes, smelling of high-end salon treatments. Richard stopped coming altogether, claiming he was too busy managing the complexities of the estate. Worse, they transferred me out of the top-tier, specialized neurological rehabilitation center I had been in and moved me to a secluded, significantly lower-tier, private long-term care facility an hour outside the city. "It's quieter here, Evelyn," Margaret had claimed, not meeting my eyes as the paramedics wheeled my stretcher into a dark, depressing room that smelled of old soup and bleach. "The other place was far too chaotic. You need peace." The truth was, the new facility was cheap. By moving me, they were minimizing my medical expenditures to maximize the amount of cash sitting in the trust they now fully controlled. I was completely isolated. The nurses at the new facility were understaffed and indifferent. Because Margaret was my medical proxy, she had explicitly instructed the staff that I was not to be given access to a phone or the internet, citing a severe psychological vulnerability to external stimuli. I was a prisoner, a $12 million hostage trapped in a broken body. But my aunt's arrogance was a fatal flaw. She believed I was stupid. She believed the narcotics had rendered my brain completely useless. 2 weeks into my stay at the new, depressing facility, Margaret visited me on a Sunday afternoon. She was carrying an old, scuffed iPad with a cracked screen. "I brought you something to pass the time, Evelyn," Margaret said, dropping the iPad onto my lap with a distinct lack of care. "It's Vanessa's old tablet." I wiped most of the apps, but I left the audiobook application. "The doctors say listening to stories might stimulate your brain. Try not to break it." She stayed for exactly 10 minutes before checking her diamond-encrusted watch and rushing out to attend a charity gala. I lay in the dim room, staring at the cracked screen of the iPad. My arms had regained enough mobility that I could painfully, slowly lift my hands to touch the screen. I opened the iPad. Margaret was not a tech-savvy woman. She hadn't factory reset the device. She had just manually deleted the games and social media apps from the home screen. But she had forgotten to log Vanessa out of her Apple iCloud account. My heart began to race. The Wi-Fi in the facility was terrible, but the iPad automatically connected to it. I didn't open the audiobook app. I opened the iMessage app. The screen populated with hundreds of blue and gray text bubbles. I scrolled down, my trembling fingers fighting against the agonizing ache in my bones. I found a group chat labeled Family Matters. The participants were Vanessa, Margaret, and Richard. I clicked on it. What I saw in that chat log made the blood freeze in my veins. It was a meticulous, months-long, sociopathic chronicle of my own manipulation. The messages started on the day of my accident. Vanessa: "Mom, did she die? Are we getting the apartment?" Margaret: "Not dead. ICU. Richard says the trucking company is on the hook. Deep pockets. We need to get to the hospital immediately." Vanessa: "Ugh, do I have to come? Hospitals smell gross." Richard: "Stay home, Vanessa. Your mother and I will play the grieving family. If the payout is as big as my lawyer thinks it is, we need to be the only ones standing by the bed when she wakes up. We need to isolate her from her friends. I read the messages, my chest heaving, tears of absolute horror and betrayal spilling down my cheeks. They hadn't rushed to my side out of love. They had rushed to secure a financial asset. I kept scrolling. The messages from the weeks I was in the ICU were even worse. Margaret. I am so sick of wiping drool off her chin. The room smells like antiseptic and pity. How much longer until the settlement comes through? Richard. The trucking lawyers are terrified. They offered $12 million. I nearly had a heart attack. Keep playing the doting aunt, Maggie. If she suspects anything, she'll hire her own wealth manager. We need her to sign the conservatorship. Vanessa. 12 million? Daddy, can I get the Porsche Cayenne now? Richard. Patience fee. The vegetable has to sign the papers first. Once I have the legal proxy, I'll buy you whatever you want out of the management fees. The vegetable. My own uncle. The man who had held my hand and cried by my bedside, calling me a vegetable while plotting to steal my settlement to buy his spoiled daughter a luxury car. My hands shook so violently I almost dropped the iPad, but I forced myself to keep reading. I needed to know everything. I needed to know the full extent of the monster's den I was trapped in. I found a series of voice memos sent within the chat, dated just 3 days after I had signed the conservatorship. I turned the volume down low and pressed play on the audio file. The unmistakable, sneering voice of my Aunt Margaret hissed through the iPad speaker. I got the facility transfer approved today, Margaret's voice said, sounding incredibly smug. We're moving her to Shady Pines on Friday. It's a dump, but it's a third of the cost of the neurocenter. Every dollar we save on her physical therapy is a dollar that stays in the trust. The doctors say she might never walk again anyway, so why waste the money on expensive rehab? We'll leave her there to rot. Once the dust settles, I'll declare her permanently incompetent, and we can start liquidating the trust to buy the yacht. Good work, Maggie, Richard's voice replied in the next audio note. Make sure the nurses know she is unstable. Cut off her phone access. If she realizes we're draining the accounts, she could try to petition the court to revoke the proxy. We need her completely silenced until the judge finalizes the permanent conservatorship hearing next month. I stopped the recording. I closed my eyes. The physical pain of my broken bones was absolutely nothing compared to the psychological agony of this betrayal. I was not a niece to them. I was a lottery ticket. They had preyed upon my trauma, manipulated my gratitude, and legally hijacked my future. They were intentionally denying me the physical therapy I needed to walk again, just to save a few bucks to fund their lavish lifestyle. They wanted me to rot in this bed forever. I opened my eyes. The tears stopped falling. The profound, paralyzing grief was instantly incinerated by a sudden nuclear explosion of pure, unadulterated rage. I was entirely immobilized. I had no access to the outside world. I was legally a ward of the state under their control. I was the perfect, helpless victim. But they had made one catastrophic mistake. They had handed me their confession. I didn't scream. I didn't throw the iPad. I meticulously forwarded the entire text thread and every single audio voice memo to an obscure, secondary email address I had created years ago for junk mail, one that my family didn't know existed. I then deleted the forwarded messages from Vanessa's sent folder to hide my tracks. Now, I had the weapon. I just needed someone on the outside to pull the trigger. I opened the Safari browser on the iPad. I couldn't call the police. Margaret had the legal conservatorship. The police would view it as a civil dispute, or worse, view me as the paranoid, medicated patient Margaret claimed I was. I needed someone ruthless. I needed someone who understood how to dismantle a toxic trust fund. I typed a name into the search bar. Elias Sterling. Elias was a highly feared, devastatingly effective personal injury and trust litigation attorney. I had worked with him designing the architectural layout for his new law firm. He was sharp, utterly uncompromising, and he owed me a favor for finishing his project under budget and ahead of schedule. I found his direct office email. I typed out a message with shaking, frantic fingers. Elias, it's Evelyn Hayes. I am trapped at Shady Pines long-term care. My relatives fraudulently obtained a medical conservatorship and hijacked a $12 million settlement. They are actively embezzling the funds and denying me medical care. I have hard audio proof of the conspiracy. Please, I am a hostage. Come see me under the guise of an insurance adjuster. Do not alert my family. I attached the audio files of Margaret and Richard's voice memos. I hit send. I deleted the sent email, closed the browser, and carefully placed the iPad back onto the rolling tray table. I lay my head back against the flat, uncomfortable hospital pillow. For the first time in 2 months, I didn't feel like a broken victim. I felt like a predator lying in wait. Margaret and Richard thought they had won. They thought the upcoming final conservatorship hearing was going to be a coronation, the moment the judge handed them the keys to my empire forever. I stared at the ceiling, a cold, vicious smile touching my lips. Let them buy their designer clothes. Let them pick out their yachts. Let them walk into that courtroom feeling like royalty. Because when the time came, I was going to burn their entire world to the ground. The 48 hours following my email to Elias Sterling were an agonizing exercise in psychological endurance. I was trapped in a broken body, confined to a dreary, understaffed room at Shady Pines, surrounded by the overwhelming stench of industrial bleach and boiled cabbage. Margaret visited me once during that window. She spent a grand total of 12 minutes sitting in the plastic chair beside my bed, scrolling through a luxury real estate website on her phone, entirely ignoring me while absent-mindedly patting my knee. I played my part perfectly. I stared blankly at the wall, keeping my breathing shallow, acting exactly like the heavily medicated, defeated victim she needed me to be. Then, on Tuesday afternoon, the door to my room swung open. An orderly wheeled a man in a crisp, conservative gray suit into the room. He was carrying a thick leather briefcase and wore a laminated visitor's badge that boldly read Liberty Mutual Insurance, Adjuster. It was Elias Sterling. "Miss Hayes," Elias said loudly, his voice projecting for the benefit of the orderly lingering in the hallway. "My name is Thomas Vance. I am a secondary claims adjuster following up on the vehicular liability release forms regarding your recent settlement. I just need to verify a few basic signatures for our internal compliance records." The orderly nodded, clearly uninterested, and walked away, pulling the heavy door shut behind him. The moment the door clicked shut, Elias's entire demeanor shifted. The bureaucratic stiffness vanished, replaced by the sharp, intense focus of a legal predator. He locked the door, pulled a small electronic sweeping device from his pocket to check for listening bugs, and then moved swiftly to my bedside. "Evelyn," Elias whispered, his voice incredibly gentle but thrumming with urgency. "I got your email. I received the audio files and the chat transcripts. What they have done to you is nothing short of a criminal atrocity." Tears of profound, crushing relief spilled from the corners of my eyes. "Elias, please, you have to get me out of here." "I am going to do much more than that," Elias promised, opening his briefcase. He pulled out a stack of heavily sealed legal documents. "I spent the last 2 days verifying the routing numbers mentioned in their text logs. Your Uncle Richard didn't just place the $12 million into a secure trust. He established a shadow LLC in Delaware and has already initiated the transfer of $2 million under the guise of retroactive caregiving compensation and administrative management fees. They are actively draining you dry." I squeezed my eyes shut, nausea rolling through my stomach. "The permanent conservatorship hearing is next week. If the judge grants it, they'll have total immunity." "They aren't going to get it," Elias said, his eyes hardening into flint. "But we have to play this perfectly. If I file an emergency motion today, Richard's lawyers will be notified. They will immediately liquidate the remaining funds, move the money offshore, and flee the jurisdiction. We cannot tip our hand. We have to let them walk into that courtroom next Thursday, believing they hold all the cards." "But I need medical care, Elias," I pleaded, gesturing to my immobilized legs. "They took me off my physical therapy schedule. My muscles are atrophying. I can't stay in this bed." "You won't," Elias assured me, pulling a pen from his pocket. "I have drafted a secret, superseding medical power of attorney. By signing this, you are privately revoking Margaret's proxy and assigning it to me. I cannot legally move you out of this facility until the judge officially nullifies their conservatorship, but with this document, I can secretly dispatch a private team of elite orthopedic specialists to this facility under the guise of an insurance-mandated wellness check. They will begin your physical therapy immediately, in this room, behind closed doors. He gently placed the pen in my hand. Sign it, Evelyn. Let me be your sword. I gripped the pen. With a renewed, fiery strength I didn't know I still possessed, I signed my name. For the next 10 days, my room at Shady Pines became a covert staging ground. Elias's private medical team visited me daily, bribing the underpaid facility staff to look the other way while they worked with me. The physical therapy was excruciating, agonizing work. Every movement sent white-hot spikes of pain through my healing pelvis and shattered femurs. But I pushed through the tears. I pushed through the screaming agony. Because every millimeter of mobility I regained was a weapon I was forging against my aunt and uncle. Margaret and Richard remained completely oblivious. When they bothered to visit, I immediately ceased my exercises and reverted to the helpless, foggy invalid. Just a few more days, darling, Margaret whispered to me on the eve of the trial, adjusting her new, incredibly expensive diamond earrings. Tomorrow, the judge will make everything official, and we can finally put all this nasty legal business behind us. You just rest. I looked at her, my face a mask of absolute blankness. Rest well, Margaret, I thought, because tomorrow your entire world burns. The atmosphere in probate courtroom 4A was steeped in solemn, bureaucratic quiet. I was wheeled into the courtroom by a court-appointed bailiff. I was sitting in a highly specialized, customized wheelchair that Elias had procured for me. I wore a simple, dignified navy blouse, my halo brace finally removed earlier that week, though a thick cervical collar still supported my neck. Margaret and Richard were already seated at the petitioner's table with their slick, high-priced attorney, a man named Mr. Caldwell. Vanessa was sitting in the front row of the gallery, aggressively chewing gum and scrolling through her phone, looking profoundly bored. When they saw me being wheeled in, Margaret immediately leaped up from her chair. She rushed over, her face twisting into a mask of overwhelming, manufactured maternal grief. "Oh, my sweet Evelyn," Margaret cried, attempting to hug me. "I was so worried the transport would be too hard on you. We're going to get this over with quickly so you can go back to sleep. Take your hands off my client, Mrs. Vance." Elias Sterling stepped through the heavy oak doors, buttoning his suit jacket. He moved with the quiet, lethal authority of an apex predator. He stepped between Margaret and my wheelchair, gently but firmly guiding me to the respondent's table. Margaret bristled, her eyes narrowing. "Who are you?" "My niece does not have independent counsel. She is medically incapacitated." "I am Elias Sterling, managing partner at Sterling and Croft," Elias replied smoothly, not looking at her as he unpacked his heavy leather briefcase. "And I am here to formally contest your petition for permanent conservatorship on behalf of Miss Hayes." At the petitioner's table, Richard's smug expression faltered for a fraction of a second. He leaned over and whispered frantically to his lawyer, "Mr. Caldwell." Caldwell frowned, but quickly composed himself, projecting an air of dismissive confidence. Judge Patricia Harmon entered the courtroom. She was a stern, highly observant woman in her early 60s, a judge renowned for her absolute lack of patience for legal theatrics. She took the bench, adjusted her reading glasses, and looked down at the massive docket. "We are here today to finalize the matter of the permanent medical and financial conservatorship of Evelyn Hayes," Judge Harmon stated, her voice ringing clearly across the polished mahogany room. "The petitioners, Margaret and Richard Vance, are requesting full, permanent proxy, citing profound physical trauma and sustained neurological incapacitation. Mr. Caldwell, you may proceed." Caldwell stood up, offering a deeply sympathetic nod to the judge. "Your Honor, this is a tragic but straightforward case. As you can see, Miss Hayes suffered catastrophic, life-altering injuries. For the past 2 months, my clients, her only living blood relatives, have sacrificed everything to manage her round-the-clock care. We have submitted affidavits from her attending physicians at Shady Pines Care Facility confirming that she requires a permanent, heavily medicated regimen and is entirely incapable of managing her own complex $12 million estate." Caldwell gestured to Margaret. "Mrs. Vance has spent every waking moment advocating for her niece. We simply ask that the court formally recognize this profound familial devotion and grant the permanent conservatorship so my clients can establish the necessary trusts to protect Evelyn's future. Judge Harmon looked over the submitted affidavits. And the respondent's counsel? Mr. Sterling, I see you filed a last-minute contestation. On what grounds? Elias stood up. He didn't pace. He didn't use theatrical gestures. He simply commanded the room with the sheer weight of his presence. Your Honor, Elias began, his voice cold and crystalline, we contest this petition on the grounds of gross, systemic medical neglect, fraudulent misrepresentation, and a highly coordinated, premeditated conspiracy to commit grand larceny. The courtroom erupted. Objection! Caldwell shouted, his face turning an angry shade of crimson. These are wild, defamatory, and entirely baseless accusations. I assure the court they are anything but baseless, Elias countered smoothly. Margaret gasped loudly, pressing a hand to her chest. How dare you? We have done nothing but love her. We saved her life. Order, Judge Harmon snapped, banging her gavel. She glared at Elias. Mr. Sterling, those are incredibly severe allegations. I am going to need substantial, irrefutable evidence, or I will hold you in contempt of this court. I have exactly that, Your Honor, Elias said. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a silver flash drive, along with a thick stack of printed transcripts. He handed a copy to the bailiff to pass to the judge, and dropped another copy directly onto Mr. Caldwell's desk. What you hold in your hands, Your Honor, is a meticulously verified log of digital communications between the petitioners Margaret, Richard, and their daughter Vanessa Vance. This communication details their explicit, premeditated intent to isolate my client, falsely portray her as mentally incapacitated, and subsequently embezzle her $12 million settlement. Richard's face drained of color. He looked at the transcript on the table as if it were a venomous snake. In the gallery, Vanessa suddenly stopped chewing her gum. Her phone slowly lowered to her lap. This is inadmissible, Caldwell stammered, frantically flipping through the pages. We have no idea where this came from. It violates privacy statutes. It was retrieved from a shared electronic device willingly given to my client by the petitioner herself, Elias corrected effortlessly. Furthermore, under the crime fraud exception, any communication that actively details the execution of a felony, specifically the embezzlement of a dependent adult's estate, is immediately admissible. Judge Harmon's eyes scanned the first page of the transcript. Her jaw visibly tightened. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Mr. Sterling, Judge Harmon said, her voice dangerously quiet. Play the audio. Objection, Your Honor, please, Caldwell pleaded, sweat now visibly beading on his forehead. Overruled, Judge Harmon barked. Play it. Elias walked over to the courtroom's multimedia console. He plugged in the silver flash drive. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. You could hear a pin drop. And then, the speakers crackled to life. First came the sound of Margaret's voice. Not the weeping, devoted, maternal voice she had used in the ICU. It was the cold, harsh, sneering tone of a woman who thought she was untouchable. I am so sick of wiping drool off her chin. The room smells like antiseptic and pity. How much longer until the settlement comes through? In the gallery, Vanessa sank lower into her seat, looking absolutely terrified. Then came Richard's voice, deep and ruthless. Keep playing the doting Aunt Maggie. If she suspects anything, she'll hire her own wealth manager. We need her to sign the conservatorship. Next, the audio of Vanessa's voice message played, high-pitched and overflowing with greedy euphoria. 2 million? Daddy, can I get the Porsche Cayenne now? And finally, the most damning, horrific confession of all. Richard's response. Patience, V. The vegetable has to sign the papers first. Once I have the legal proxy, I'll buy you whatever you want out of the management fees. Caldwell, their high-priced attorney, physically pushed his chair away from Richard. He stared at his own clients with utter, unadulterated disgust. The recording continued to the voice memos sent after I was transferred to the terrible facility. We're moving her to Shady Pines on Friday. Margaret's recorded voice boasted gleefully. It's a dump, but it's a third of the cost of the neurocenter. Every dollar we save on her physical therapy is a dollar that stays in the trust. The doctors say she might never walk again anyway, so why waste the money on expensive rehab? We'll leave her there to rot. Once the dust settles, I'll declare her permanently incompetent, and we can start liquidating the trust to buy the yacht." Elias stopped the audio. The sheer, breathtaking cruelty of their words echoed off the mahogany walls, hanging in the air like a physical stench. I looked at Margaret. The impeccable, perfectly manicured facade of the loving aunt had completely, violently imploded. Her face was chalk white. She was shaking uncontrollably, her mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish, unable to formulate a single word. Richard was staring straight ahead, completely paralyzed. The arrogant entrepreneur was dead. He was looking directly at the barrel of a federal prison sentence. "Your Honor," Elias said, breaking the lethal silence. "While actively denying my client necessary neurological rehabilitation to save a few bucks, Richard Vance used his temporary financial proxy to establish a shadow LLC in Delaware. As we speak, he has already attempted to wire $2 million of my client's settlement into an offshore account for a down payment on a luxury yacht and a Porsche for his daughter." Judge Harmon slowly took off her reading glasses. She placed them on her desk. She looked at Richard and Margaret. The fury radiating from the bench was palpable, a terrifying, righteous wrath. "Mr. and Mrs. Vance," Judge Harmon whispered. Her voice was barely above a breath, yet it carried the weight of a thunderclap. "In my 30 years on the bench, I have presided over cases of profound human failing. But I have rarely, if ever, witnessed such calculated, depraved, psychopathic cruelty inflicted upon a completely vulnerable, traumatized family member. Your Honor, please, we were just trying to protect the assets," Richard stammered, his voice cracking, a pathetic, desperate attempt to salvage the unsalvageable. "Do not speak!" Judge Harmon roared, slamming her gavel down with such force it sounded like a gunshot. "You referred to your own niece as a vegetable. You intentionally condemned her to a substandard medical facility to rot so you could buy a yacht with her blood money. You sat in my courtroom and presented fraudulent medical affidavits to strip a woman of her fundamental human rights for your own personal enrichment." Judge Harmon turned to Caldwell. "Mr. Caldwell, are you continuing your representation of these individuals?" Caldwell stood up, rapidly shaking his head. "No, Your Honor. I am immediately withdrawing as counsel. I was entirely unaware of the fraudulent nature of their claims and the act of embezzlement." "Wise choice," Judge Harmon said. She picked up her pen and began writing furiously on the docket. "The petition for permanent conservatorship is denied with extreme prejudice," Judge Harmon announced, her voice echoing with finality. "The temporary proxy is hereby immediately revoked and nullified. Full legal, medical, and financial autonomy is restored to Evelyn Hayes." I let out a shuddering gasp, tears of pure, overwhelming relief finally spilling down my cheeks. I gripped the armrests of my wheelchair, a massive, crushing weight instantly lifting off my chest. Furthermore, Judge Harmon continued, her eyes locking onto Richard and Margaret. "Bailiff, take Mr. and Mrs. Vance into custody." "What?" Margaret shrieked, jumping to her feet, her voice shrill with panic. "No! You can't do this! We are a respectable family." "You are thieves and abusers," Judge Harmon corrected her coldly. "I am holding you both in contempt of court for profound perjury and the submission of fraudulent documents. Additionally, I am signing an immediate emergency warrant for your arrest on the charges of elder and dependent adult abuse, conspiracy to commit grand larceny, and felony wire fraud." 2 bailiffs moved in instantly. They grabbed Richard, who was too stunned to fight, pulling his arms behind his back. Margaret, however, completely lost her mind. She thrashed, screaming at the top of her lungs, kicking at the bailiff. "Evelyn, tell them to stop. We're your family. Evelyn, please." I looked at her. I looked at the woman who had wiped my chin while plotting to leave me in a dark room to rot. "You aren't my family, Margaret," I said, my voice incredibly calm, ringing out clearly over her hysterical screams. "You're just the people who happen to share my DNA. Enjoy the yacht." The metallic, heavy click of the handcuffs snapping shut around Margaret's wrists was the most beautiful symphony I had ever heard. As they dragged Margaret and Richard out of the courtroom, Vanessa jumped up from the gallery, sobbing hysterically, trying to follow her parents, only to be stopped by a third officer who informed her she was also being detained for questioning regarding her complicity in the conspiracy. When the courtroom doors finally swung shut, sealing their fate, The room plunged back into a stunned silence. Judge Harmon looked down at me from the bench. Her stern expression softened significantly. "Miss Hayes," Judge Harmon said gently, "the court is profoundly sorry for what you have endured at the hands of those you were supposed to trust. The court has frozen all accounts associated with Richard Vance. Every single penny of your settlement will be returned to your exclusive control by the end of the day." "Thank you, Your Honor," I whispered. "Take your life back, Evelyn," the judge smiled. 1 year later. The healing process of a shattered body is not linear. It is a grueling, agonizing marathon of physical therapy, tears, setbacks, and incredibly hard-won victories. But I didn't have to do it in a dark, depressing room that smelled of bleach. With my funds fully restored and securely managed by Elias Sterling's firm, I transferred to the absolute best, state-of-the-art neurological rehabilitation center in the country. I worked with world-class orthopedic surgeons and relentless physical therapists. I fought through the pain every single day, fueled by a blazing, inextinguishable desire to reclaim my independence. The criminal justice system moved with an uncharacteristic, brutal efficiency for my aunt and uncle. Faced with the undeniable audio recordings and the paper trail of the offshore LLC, they had no defense. They were convicted of multiple counts of felony wire fraud, dependent adult abuse, and conspiracy. Richard was sentenced to 9 years in a federal penitentiary. Margaret, who attempted to blame the entire scheme on her husband, was sentenced to 7 years. Vanessa managed to avoid prison time by testifying against her own parents, but she was left utterly destitute, stripped of the luxury lifestyle she felt so entitled to. They were gone, completely, entirely erased from my world. It was a crisp, beautiful afternoon in late October. I stood in the center of the massive, sunlit living room of my newly designed, fully accessible, custom-built home. I was an architect. I had designed every single inch of it myself during my months in rehab. It had wide hallways, huge floor-to-ceiling windows that let in the warm autumn light, and a massive wraparound deck overlooking a quiet, peaceful lake. I wasn't in a wheelchair anymore. I was standing on my own 2 feet. I held an elegant, custom-carved wooden cane in my right hand, a permanent reminder of the trauma I had survived, but a symbol of the immense strength it took to overcome it. I walked slowly, carefully, across the polished hardwood floor, making my way to the open glass doors of the patio. My legs ached, a dull, lingering throb that the doctors said would likely always be there. But it was a small price to pay for freedom. Elias Sterling was standing on the deck, leaning against the railing, holding 2 cups of coffee. Over the past year, he had transitioned from my ruthless legal advocate to my closest, most trusted confidant. He turned around as I stepped out onto the deck. He watched me walk, a profound, genuine smile spreading across his face. "You're moving faster today," Elias noted, handing me a warm mug. "I have things to do, Elias," I smiled, taking a sip of the coffee, looking out at the shimmering water of the lake. I'd just finalized the blueprints for a new pediatric wing at the Neurocenter. Pro bono. I want to build spaces that help people heal. Elias clinked his mug gently against mine. To building new spaces. I took a deep breath, the cool, crisp autumn air filling my lungs. My relatives had looked at my broken body and seen a vulnerable, helpless victim they could easily exploit. They thought a catastrophic accident had stripped me of my power, but they were wrong. The accident had broken my bones, but it hadn't touched my spirit. They thought they had buried me in the dark, but they didn't realize they had simply planted a seed. I had grown back stronger. I had reclaimed my life, my dignity, and my future. And as I stood on my own 2 feet, looking out at the beautiful world I had built for myself, I knew that I was finally, truly unbreakable.